It's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks, Charlie, so much for making this happen. It's really fun to have a group of people who are interested and excited about the future and making predictions about it. I've been thinking about the future quite a lot, both with a couple of different hats on. Although my day job is a physicist, I've been part of the Future of Life Institute, which is thinking about the future of major transformative technologies, AI, nanotech, genetic engineering, and so on, and kind of where they're leading us in the coming decades. But I've also, as you've heard, been very involved in this thing called Metaculus, which is an effort to really just create the best possible predictions about future technology and events in general by whatever means necessary. And the way that the platform has really started is as a prediction kind of solicitation and aggregation. That is, people can post any question they like on the platform, and there will be moderators that will help refine that into a really good, solid sort of question that sort of is exact enough to make predictions on. Then people make predictions on that question using whatever means they would like to. Those predictions will be probabilities, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then the key thing is that as time goes on and something actually happens or doesn't happen, then those predictions are checked against what actually happens. And so people gain points and reputation and credibility in going through this process. And the magic is then both people get better at predicting by using the system. This is just a skill that you can develop. That's definitely something that we've seen in our predictors, and I've seen it in myself. Just you get better at understanding what goes into a prediction. But also the system gets better at making predictions because it learns who are the really, really capable predictors, who has a really good track record, and also what are the statistics behind the predictions. Like, it may be that people tend to be overconfident. They predict more likely that things will happen than it is that they actually happen. And then the algorithm can adjust for that and kind of, using the large amount of data that it's aggregated so far, make better and better predictions as a system, even while all the individuals who are kind of feeding into it get better at predicting themselves. So that's kind of the basic idea of Metaculus, is to create this way for people to get together, learn about what's interesting about the future, make predictions, learn about what happens, interact with each other, and kind of share information about it and discuss future events. And people have found it pretty fun and interesting, and I certainly have, as well as just enlightening about what is coming down the line future-wise. So I wanted to talk about a few aspects of it, and then open it up for lots of questions and discussion. One is, I think when people first think about making predictions about things, they often feel like they have to predict something exactly, like this is what's going to happen, or that is what's going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, you're wrong. And I think that's not quite the right way to think about it. You want to have predictions that are accountable, but the right way to think about predictions is in terms of probabilities. That when you get a weather forecast, there's a 75% chance of rain or a 90% chance of rain, and that's a really useful piece of information because it's something you can then turn into actions. Like 90% chance of rain, I'm going to take my umbrella. 10%, 20% chance of rain, well, it depends how heavy my umbrella is and how much I want to drag it around, and so on. So we take actions based on the likelihood of future events, and probabilities are the way that we really describe those likelihoods. And technically, probability, when I teach my class in mathematics and probabilities, there are two sort of basic definitions of those. One is in terms of how often something happens, how often a given thing happens relative to all the different possibilities. So when you say, rolling a 1 on a die is a 1 in 6 chance, you really mean that if you roll the die lots of times, like 1/6 of the time, it'll come up with a 1. So it's thought of in terms of like lots of different trials and how often something comes up. But you can also think of probability, and we often do, as a degree of belief. Like, what odds would we bet at as like rational people is directly translatable into a probability. So if there's a 50% probability of something, and if we think there's a 50% probability of something and someone gives us like 2-to-1 odds, we might really want to take that bet or not take the bet, depending on which side we're on, because we can translate back and forth between those. And probabilities, I think, are very important both to think about because it's the right way to sort of quantitatively talk about things happening in the future, but because when we don't use them, we get very confused. Like if people say, it's rather probable that this will happen, like what does that mean? It could mean that it's rather probable, like 80% chance it's going to happen, or it's rather probable, maybe 30% chance. And so people talking to each other just using words gets very confusing. So there's actually a whole bunch of studies about how to translate probabilities into words. So this was what you see on the slide here is like the most fancy table that I could find, translating between verbal expressions and probabilities, like impossible is 0% probability and certain is 100% probability, and all these different words in between. And these are helpful, I think, for getting a sense of how to translate a subjective feeling that you have about the likelihood of something into a probability. But they're also still pretty ambiguous. If you tell someone it's somewhat doubtful that something will happen, will they really come up with the same number as you do? So I personally think it's really nice. It's really refreshing to me when people talk about probabilities directly, like, is this going to happen? Well, I think there's a 75% chance. That is a really useful piece of information for me. And it's the right way, I think, to express both a degree of precision and a degree of uncertainty. If I say there's a 50-50 chance, I'm telling you that there's an uncertainty, but I'm also telling you exactly how uncertain I am. If I say there's a 95% chance that something's going to happen, there's still a 5% chance that it won't. I've expressed that there is some uncertainty, but in a very precise and useful way. So I think it's a great practice. I try to get into the practice, and I love when I see other people using probabilities. And one person I found who does this and that I like is Elon Musk. He famously makes a lot of predictions. They tend to be a little bit on the rosy side when they're about the things that he's doing, as it turns out. But I like that he gives numbers to things, and he's not always right about. Those predictions they're not always great predictions in terms of some of them come out the way he predicts and some of them don't. But he really thinks in terms of probabilities, and he thinks in terms of timescales, and he likes to make concrete predictions. So one of the fun side projects that we did with Metaculus was just try to collect all the predictions that either Elon Musk had made about himself, or that people on Metaculus had made about stuff that Elon Musk does. So we've collected them into this timeline of like different Elon Musk stuff. This is an example where he said that he would eat his hat if a United Launch Alliance's Vulcan rocket carried a certain payload by the early 2020s. So Metaculus is currently predicting a 25% chance that will happen, and Elon Musk will supposedly have to eat his hat. We haven't posed the question of whether he'll actually eat his hat if this happens, although I would probably bet that he does. That's the kind of stunt that he would enjoy doing. But so this is both fun, but I think it's also important because it's useful to know, when public figures make predictions about the future or announcements about the future, like how seriously should you take those? And I think the right way to think about that is how right have they been in the past? So kind of understanding and assessing the track record of people who are making predictions gives you a sense of whether you should believe them or not, in the future. And that sort of brings me to what sorts of predictions people, organizations, companies are now relying on, because we do, every decision that we make, really, whether we realize it or not, is making predictions. If I want to decide what am I going to eat for breakfast tomorrow, I'm really thinking about, well, I could eat this or I could eat that. And I'm predicting, how much am I going to enjoy this? How much am I going to enjoy that? How am I going to feel after one versus the other? So we're really making predictions and then comparing those predictions against what we want, which is to have, say, an enjoyable breakfast that makes us feel good and we feel good about having eaten and didn't cost too much money and so on. So even the most trivial predictions or decisions, we're really making predictions. But when the stakes get higher, and when we really want quantities, we want quantitative predictions of what's going to happen to base our decisions on. And that's just provably the right thing to do. If you want the best outcome, you should be making predictions of all the different consequences of the choices you could make, comparing those against what your goals are, and choosing the action that gives you the highest expected value. That is the highest probability times sort of outcome. That's the prediction that you should make, or the choice that you should make. And so I think companies and organizations are starting to realize the importance of this, and that it's not always the best just to have somebody using their gut instinct to make a decision, which has been sort of the norm in the past, but are using a lot more quantitative modeling, a lot more machine learning. And I think the sort of prediction market or crowd forecasting platform that Metaculus represents is a kind of third leg, that you can do projections using modeling and data, which is great if you have lots of data and you have a theory and you have the skilled person to analyze them and create a model. That's what scientists do, right? We take data, we have a theory, we make predictions, and sometimes that works out spectacularly well, and there are really great predictions that come out of it. On the other hand, sometimes you don't have a really good model. It's a complicated system. Machine learning can be great if you have a ton of training data and you just want to say, okay, I'm going to set up a machine learning system to ferret out what are the patterns, what are the correlations in this data, and ask a series of questions and have my machine learning system make predictions in response to my questions. And that can work really well if you have lots and lots of data, even if you don't really understand exactly what the trends are. It can sort of ferret some of those out for you. But there are only a very limited class of questions you can ask it that are sort of compatible with the data that you gave it. If you want to know, like, who's going to win this Supreme Court case because that has an effect on my business, or is this company going to acquire that one, or is this drug going to pass its stage 1 clinical trial, or who's going to be elected, or what's the timeline for this new technology coming out? When is this rocket going to launch? Questions like that. There's just no machine learning system that is going to touch those. There's no sense in which it will understand what the question is, and there's no data to feed it. So you just have to have something that has humans. And I think the best way to do that at this point is a system where humans who understand the question, who are trained in forecasting, get together, make their predictions, discuss them, and kind of ferret out what the probabilities are. So that's what Metaculus represents. And just to, I think Charlie may have mentioned a little bit or in the introduction, I personally came to this question of how to make predictions from a couple of different standpoints. My day job is a physicist at UC Santa Cruz, but I've also been involved in 2 nonprofit organizations, the Future of Life Institute and the Foundational Questions Institute. The Foundational Questions Institute is really a scientific organization about big questions in science. The Future of Life Institute, as I've said, is about technology and kind of the long-term future of technology and what we might do now to anticipate what's going to happen and sort of adjust our decisions and the way we think accordingly. And that got me thinking that we really needed a way to think about, like, what does the future look like? How do we make good predictions about it? And so that led to Metaculus. So for me, I've had this journey of really wanting to understand better what the future looks like so we can make good decisions now and kind of make a better world out of it. But in doing so, realize that prediction is important for all kinds of things, and that there are lots of people who may be interested in using such a platform. And so we've tried hard to make it just useful for lots of people, groups, organizations, businesses, and we're looking for interest and feedback of what will be useful to people. What can we do to Metaculus to make it useful to as many people as possible and as effective as possible? And so I'm excited to get feedback and questions and thoughts from all of you on what your thinking is about the future, what kind of questions you would like to know the answers to, what sort of system would give you the sort of information that might change your decisions or might inform your decisions the best, and those sorts of things. So
yeah,
thanks for listening, and now I'd love to have some discussion.
Yeah, let's give him a round of applause. Thank you so much. So I'm going to kick off with a question, and then I'm going to also take questions from the audience so that everyone can kind of, those things that you were like prompting people to ask, I want to make sure people can ask you and you can ask them back. One of the first questions, I thought it was a great question, is actually comes from Charlie. So you've been working on the platform for about 2 years now. How has this changed how you think about, has it changed how you think about predicting the future? And has there been anything that's like surprised you in terms of how it's either changed how you think about predicting the future, or how it's maybe changed how other people are predicting the future?
Yeah, I think one thing I've been very surprised by is we go around thinking, when we have questions about the future, we tend to think that those are like reasonably well-defined questions, and they're really not for the most part. When you go and ask a question like that you're really interested in, will Tesla succeed, or will Apple introduce this sort of new capability in the iPhone, or will this scientific discovery be made? When we go to actually write those down as a question that either is or is not going to have an answer, like yes, that happened, no, it didn't happen, then we suddenly realize that question we had in our mind is not that precise. Like all kinds of things come up of, well, what if this happens? What if that happens? What if that happens? So one of the interesting things I've learned, I would say, is that just asking the right questions is a tremendously informative exercise. So when you go down, I was telling Charlie earlier, a question that I just recently posed was about an act in Congress to give some clear rules about cryptocurrencies and whether they count as tokens versus securities and so on, because that's been this ambiguous regulatory space. So what you sort of want to know is there finally going to be some clarity in this situation? But that's not itself a clear question. You can ask clear things like, is this legislation going to pass? Is it going to pass both houses? Is it going to be signed into law? Or is something similar, if this one doesn't pass, is something similar going to be passed? So once you start to think through those things, you start to think of all the different ways that events could happen this year or next year. And so rather than having this one kind of vague question, you start to think through much more precise trains of events that might occur. And I think in thinking those through, you're thinking about how the future might unfold just gets much, much more clear. You have a much more concrete view of it.
Awesome, great. I'm actually going to have, if you have a question, I'm actually going to have you come up here and ask directly in here, just so that he can hear you and see your face. Is that, yeah. Say your name, where you're from, maybe what you do if you feel like sharing that.
Hi, I'm Charmian Uy, very boring finance. But assuming you ask the right question, are there categories of topics or questions where the platform is more accurate in predicting?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So one of the fun things about Metaculus is that all of the track record, all the predictions are just there online. Everybody can look at them and see how it's done on different topics. So anyone is invited to go to the track record page, and I can share that, how to do that. And you can pull down different topics because everything has different topic tags, and see for this topic, how is Metaculus done? Now, if you break it down too finely, a lot of the topics don't have enough data. One thing that I can tell you is that Metaculus is good at many things. It's bad at Donald Trump, and it's bad at cryptocurrencies. So those two things are very hard, as it turns out, both very unpredictable. It's quite good, so far I've seen, at more technology and scientific questions. So it's pretty good at talking about whether a given technology, like in machine learning, say, or AI, at whether a given benchmark will be reached by a certain time. in scientific events, whether a certain paper will be cited a given number of times, or whether a discovery will be found to be true, and things like that. So it's pretty good on the science and tech. It's less strong, I would say, on what we know are very unpredictable things, financial ups and downs, and politics.
Great. I assume you're standing because you wanted to ask a question next. And remember to state your name, where you're from.
Yeah, hi. My name is Alexei Potapov. I'm a transhumanist, 20 years, founder of Russian transhumanist movement, and a lot of companies connected with the future directly. So my question is, do you know what's future shock level is?
Future shock level.
Element of the concept that have like 5 layers of technology, different technologies that people either like, dislike, or can't imagine in their mind. So basically, for us, it means the general public don't understand first what the future is a general concept, right? That's why we hear all the time, in the future we will be. But the future, it's a process, it's a process that doesn't stop, so there's no like future that something will be in this future. And how you deal with general inability to understand what the future is, and then like make a prediction on top of this inability, basically.
Yeah, so I think, so as constituted, Metaculus is a collection of individual questions about individual well-defined events or things. So there's sort of, will this happen, or what will this number be, or when will such and such happen? Now, as you said, to ask those questions, you have to have a particular sort of vision or timeline in mind, a context in which to ask those questions. And I think it will be interesting, and this is definitely within our plans, to start to tie together questions in a more of a scenario planning capability. So to think through, let's think, suppose this happens, and then what are given that happens, what are some possibilities that come out of that, and sort of put together different timelines. Once you put together those timelines, you can then ask for the probabilities of the things within those timelines happening. And so you can map out the probabilities of all those different branching possible futures, and start to think about which ones are most probable, which ones are probable given that X happened or that Y happened. So that's, you put your finger on a little bit of kind of what the longer term goal is, which is, as my first slide said, to really map out what the future looks like, both quantitatively with the probabilities and qualitatively, like what do those futures actually look like, by doing things more like scenario planning and kind of envisioning exercises and world building exercises. Because if you can't even envision at all what the future looks like, then it's very hard to ask sort of interesting, concrete probability questions about it.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Does anyone else have a question next? I have questions if people aren't. Okay, so you went first, and then so come up and you can ask. Remember to state your name, where you're from, and maybe what you do.
Hello, Professor. I'm Eric Miller, and I'm an industrial designer. And I'm interested in AI also. So maybe it's a little bit different way of talking about something that you just talked about. But for example, in AI, there are like big questions. Do you think about how you might set up your system, or would it be valuable for your system to take those bigger questions and thorny issues and sort of break them down into smaller ones, and then map them out and correlate them and things like
Absolutely.
That? Will an AI system evolve to create its own nation, for example?
Yeah. So you totally hit the nail on the head. I think when you ask a big headline question like, will there be artificial general intelligence at some point in the coming decades? Like, we kind of all want to know this, but again, it's very hard to get traction on that one big question. But if you try to break it down into, what are some near term and midterm and later term indications of that, and make concrete questions about those, that's actually the very project that So there's something called ai.metaculus.com, which is a segment of Metaculus specifically set up to make predictions about artificial intelligence advances. And I should say that what you see when you go to Metaculus is like the main Metaculus site, which has lots of public questions. But we've also created a system of what are called domains, where you can create a particular, like if you're very interested in AI, for example, we have a contract that set up that ai.metaculus.com system. There's another one that's focused on health and mobility, so that's a separate site. And those are places where you can set up a system to kind of delve much more deeply and break one big issue down into lots of little ones that you can then try to connect together to really like dig into an issue in a fine-grained way, and with a dedicated group of people. So with the AI site, for example, that's an invitation-only site where they really tried to get AI experts and researchers to like get together and make predictions on that thing. So yes, absolutely. I think that's exactly what we want to do. And we're working on different modes of making that possible, given the platform.
Okay, great. We have another question coming right around the table to you.
Max.
Hello.
Hi there.
So you mentioned that certain
Name and
Oh.
what you do.
Sorry. Okay. Max Sklar. I'm a machine learning engineer, and I got a podcast called The Local Maximum. You mentioned that certain topics were more difficult to predict than others, for example, politics and cryptocurrency. Do you calibrate those, like we saw in the first slide, do you calibrate those so that the probabilities go back like close to 50%? And for some of the other ones, maybe you'll make a more far out 90% prediction? Or is it the case that in those cases, no, even the calibrations can't be done properly? And if that's the case, like, why do you think that is? You think it's because even for a coin flip, I should be able to calibrate pretty well at 50%. Like, I know not to veer off that.
Right.
So it's like, but if I can't calibrate it, then I have other questions, in terms of what's going on here.
Yeah. So what's relatively easy to do is get a good calibration in that. So that's hard for individuals to do because we don't tend to carry around calibrated probabilities with us unless we've been thinking in terms of probabilities a lot. But we can get better at it. But what the system can do is kind of recalibrate things when it does the aggregation, and it does do that. So, but the problem is being good at prediction is both a question of calibration. That is for the non aficionados, like when you say 90% probable. For the things that you say 90% probable, do in fact 9 out of 10 of those things happen? Or is it more like 50% happen when you say 90% probable? So you're well calibrated if the actual fraction of events that you say 90% to is like 9 and 10. You're poorly calibrated if it's some very different number. So it's always easy to be really well calibrated if you like guess 50% for everything. So if you guess 50% for everything, you'll probably do pretty well calibration-wise, but that's pretty useless in terms of information. So what you want is a combination both of good calibration and good precision, meaning that lots of your predictions are like 95% or 5%. So if you can be well calibrated and very precise, then you're doing a really great job. So I think with cryptocurrencies, I would say that there was for example, there were a combination of some over precise predictions, like there was a freak event where Ethereum, like for 1 second, was higher than Bitcoin, and this just caused a lot of people to lose a lot of points because they confidently predicted that would not happen. So that I think was an indication that there were fatter tails, than people were anticipating. With politics, I think it's just hard, and so there just isn't a lot of precision. So I think it's not a question that people are being precise and getting things wrong so much as that they're not confident enough to be precise. So the predictions are all kind of around the 40 and 60% range, and so they're well calibrated, but just not that great.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think the political stuff around 40, 60% don't go past that. All right, thanks.
You guys are bringing the thunder.
Yeah,
Love
these
it.
are great questions. So I think we only have 7 minutes left.
Yeah.
So
we have a hard stop. So
Yeah. So one thing I do want to make sure he has time to actually ask us. Is there anything you want to ask the audience or like our room here?
Let me make sure we did.
To get. Oh, okay. Actually, sorry. We're gonna have one more person, and then we're gonna have you do that.
Are they, I just want to know because we're not gonna. I know you have one too. Okay. Raise your hand if you definitely have a question.
If you definitely have a question you'd like to ask, raise your hand right now. We have like one more.
Okay. Okay. No problem.
Great. Sorry.
And then. Okay.
Hi, I'm Latoya. I am a project manager. I created a forum called Woke AI, and the goal is to change the design process around artificial intelligence and helping designers be more inclusive in their design practices by using a combination of project management, development, and interdisciplinary collaboration. So there's a lot going on there. Now, my question is specific to some of the ratings. So I looked at the website and I noticed that you rank individual by this point system, and you have like different categories: time traveler, time lord. What types of follow-ups do you determine, or like, do you have any like data or collect information on those individuals to ascertain how they've become so effective in this prediction process? And do you look at like the diversity or the range of individuals that are participating to see if the questions are, so it's a 2-part question. I guess that was one part.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say the answer is not too much. So we've deliberately kept the, like it would be nice to gather a whole bunch of detailed information about all the people who are making these predictions, but at the cost of like annoying them that they have to fill out some long survey and so on and divulge all that information. So we've mainly gathered statistical information about the sorts of predictions that they make and the track record that they have and which questions they've done well on and which ones they haven't. We haven't done much work trying to correlate that with like other aspects of their background, their views, things like that. There is quite a significant literature on that though. So there was a large project called the Good Judgment Project and a project run by IARPA where they did something like Metaculus. They had crowd forecasting, but they also had a very extensive survey and like tests and stuff that people did before they went in. And so they worked to kind of figure out what are the attributes of people that make them good predictors. And they found not surprising things like being good with numbers and comfortable with probabilities was important. Being open-minded, being smart, they're like sort of fairly obvious things. And then there were some slightly more interesting ones, like being willing to change your mind and things like that, or be convinced by evidence. If you go into things with a very firm mindset, like this is what's going to happen, regardless of what evidence you hear, that's going to tend to not make you a great predictor. So there is a literature on this, I would say. It's something that we haven't done that much of, though. I think it would probably be, as you suggest, a good idea to, once we have some of these really good predictors identified, at least from them, try to gather some more information and do extra, trying to learn what some of their secrets are to that good predicting.
And the second part was amongst categories. So that was the other part. Like, are they predictors amongst certain categories? But that is.
Yeah, I think the good predictors tend to be good across a lot of categories, is what we've seen so far. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. We have a hard stop. This recording is going to stop at 8:30. So.
Oh no.
Yeah, no, you're gonna get cut. No. So, what's your question?
Worry about the blind spot in the prediction.
Yeah, come here.
Anthony, could you do us a favor? Answer this question, but we have like 4 minutes. So.
Okay, I'll be very quick answer.
Just really quick. My name is Xiaoyun. I was a cosmologist in my previous life, but I'm gonna work
Okay.
as an internal strategy consultant. So, so you said some of the people who can participate in the forum are by invitation. How do you worry about the blind spot in their predictions, like based on their background?
What sort of blind spot do you mean?
So I'm just worried about the lack of diversity.
The AI one is invite only. The regular one is anyone can sign up.
Also but in both of the, do you worry about the like the echo chamber effect or the people who participate in the forum maybe will skew the prediction one way or the other.
Yeah, I think there are lots of things you can worry about, but only some that you can do something about. So I think our focus is on, getting the best predictions that we can and giving people the tools and kind of the incentives to make good predictions. Like we're working on things where people can make mini teams and kind of collaborate. We can provide training sessions. So there are certain things. Yeah, I'm very interested in anything that we can do to make the predictions better. And insofar as we can get data that allows us to see what things we could do better, or find other studies and other psychology studies or social science studies that can help us understand what we can do better, I'm interested in those. So yes, I'm worried about those things, and I think the thing to do with that worry is to just try to make the platform more effective at what it does, in my view.
And so last thing, what question would you like, even if we can't answer it for you right now because it's going to get cut off in a second, what question would you like to leave us with, or like last thought you'd like to leave us with?
Yeah, I guess my question would be, what would it take what kind of evidence would be interesting enough to you to say, I'm going to now trust this set of predictions about the future, whether it's Metaculus or somewhere else, in actually making my decisions? Like, at what point would you say, I'm going to decide this thing, so I'm going to take that question, put it on here, see what the prediction is, and have that inform my decision, rather than it just be kind of a fun, interesting exercise to look at the future?
Yeah, that's like, I think, a really important point. And I think before you joined, we were talking about that being a really important principle of these type of platforms, and like crowd wisdom in general is that element of trust.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and consistency.
And consistency, yeah.
Consistency is really
And like, I don't know, if anyone have a short, do you want to do, or just want
to?
Leave. Okay, so anyone has any things, you can email Charlie following up.
Yes, I want to turn around. I want you guys to wave goodbye to him. Let me see. Are we getting you? Can you see it? Can you see it?
Too short. I mean, I wanted more time with everyone.
See, I think the recording. So all the hands went up when I asked them if they want to do a workshop with you. So now you have to come to New York. Okay.
That's legally binding.
I like New York.
Are legally binding.
We'll talk. Okay.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Sounds good.
Really appreciate it. We'll have the recording for you tomorrow.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for setting this up. I wish there were more time to interact with all these cool people, but maybe in the future.
Do a follow-up one. But thank you so much.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. You too.